Plenty of time. Thank you. Please welcome Dr. Brobst-Renaud for our Bible study session.
I was telling someone yesterday, the way an academic goes to a seminar is you buy all of your books and you carry all of them because you don't have time to go to the gym or lift weights. But part of the function of that is when you get to a seminar and you're sitting around this table, you pile your books just high enough that the professor can't see you in hopes that they never call on you and ask you to summarize what you've just read because you've read about 300 pages and have no idea what any of it meant. I've only brought 2 books up here today. One of them I will actually read. I want to begin this morning with a quote from Robert Farrar Capon. Grace is a celebration of life, relentlessly hounding all the non-celebrants in the world. It is a floating cosmic bash, shouting its way through the streets of the universe, flinging the sweetness of its cassations to every window, pounding at every door in a hilarity beyond all liking and happening, until the prodigals come out at last and dance, and the elder brothers finally take their fingers out of their ears. It's probably my favorite quote on this parable. So today we're moving to modern identity construction. Where we've already done a thing. I put a little check. I love check boxes. My congregation knows that when I get stressed or anxious, I make a list. And sometimes I put things on the list that I've already done just to make the check mark. Anybody? I see some, yeah, green cards, right? Yes. Yes, if ever you're super stressed out, just make a checklist of stuff you've already done. And I did a lot today. I made coffee. It's a good morning. All right, today we are in session 2. We're going to talk about some modern ideas about identity formation. Yesterday, Bishop Gronberg was talking about how we learn from people that maybe don't even identify as Lutherans, maybe Baptists, God help us. And we also learn from people who don't confess the same faith, and in some ways, listening to people who maybe don't even share the Christian faith. I don't know about any of you, but being in conversation with these folks has helped me reflect on my faith and has deepened it. God uses everything in creation that's not nailed down. And then sometimes God moves the mountains and uses all that's been nailed down. And then later on today, we'll go into how God is forming us for the future. Spoiler alert, I won't solve any of those problems for you. I'll just give you a bunch of questions and hope for the best. Okay. Where are we going today? First, we'll discuss some modern theories of identity. Don't get too scared. I basically just summarized them all and tried to put them in normal people language. These theories center around relationship by Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian author, and confession, Judith Butler. And we'll have a choose-your-own-adventure activity with a few options to discuss the parable of the prodigals in light of meeting these folks in the middle of their stories. We don't know what happened before. What made the younger brother the way he was? What made the elder brother the way he was? What made the father the way that he was? Where we've been. We talked about what audiences might have been programmed to hear in the ancient world. A man had 2 sons, and the audience, especially a Jewish Christian audience, is going to think, oh, uh-oh. And then if you go to a Greco-Roman audience, they're going to hear there's this guy that was prodigal, he squandered everything, and then he came home with his tail between his legs. And the ancient audiences who may have been familiar with these character types would have been like, okay, that guy's going to be okay. And then they would have heard about the elder brother who's selfish and doesn't want to join the party, and they would have said, it's not going to go well. Luke says, wait a minute. Identity formation in the ancient world, we talked about theophrastus, we talked about the ne'er-do-well, decency be damned sort of person, and the person who would dig through the floorboards just to find a coin. Again, Luke has different views on this. Luke thinks the woman who's searching through the floorboards to find 1 coin when she has 9 good ones is what? She's setting a good example. All right. So there are two sons, both of whom are at odds with their father's generosity. One of them spent everything, and the other doesn't know that he already has it all. But for the father, neither son is beyond remedy. Remember, the father, when he sees the younger son, what does he do? He runs for him. When he notices the elder brother's not at the party, what does he do? Y'all hang out and talk amongst yourselves. I'm going to go get my boy. The father crosses the threshold twice, once for each of his sons. So modern individuals frequently associate, as we saw in our little note cards in our discussions yesterday, with one of the characters in the parable. And we often think of the Father as representative of God, and him being the character that we're all supposed to emulate. Spoiler alert, how many of you are that generous to your family all the time? What was last Christmas like for y'all? No drama? Anybody have no drama last Christmas? Anybody have rules against political conversations at the Christmas dinner table, Thanksgiving dinner table? Anybody, you have little placards with hot button issues that you're all going to discuss at the dinner table? No? Nobody? Me neither. No way. All right, so we're going to talk about Mikhail Bakhtin a little bit. He's a Russian author that works on, one of the things he's written a lot of stuff, but the thing I honed in on is he talks about interdividuality, not individuality, but interdividuality, and this term really stuck with me. Backing up a moment, he thinks that humans, especially in narrative, exist at the threshold. And for him, the threshold is where we leave ourselves and encounter another person. The threshold is where we encounter new information. The threshold is where faith happens. I don't know about any of you, but in my relatively short life, I've had a few times where I come from German folk. And I don't know if there's any other Germans here, but German folk are known. We have this quality. I call it determination. But it's just stark stubbornness. And then a German married a Dutch person in my family. So now I'm not only incredibly stubborn, but I'll tell you about it. The threshold is where we meet one another. The threshold is where we engage Scripture. The threshold takes us to a place where we're not quite sure what's going to happen. And this stubbornness, I don't know about what y'all's relationship with God is like, but when God wants me to trust, God takes me by the nape of the neck and hangs me over the edge of the cliff and says, "What are you going to do?" I hope none of y'all ever have to live through that, but if you end up out on the edge of the cliff, and God's just saying, "Okay, jump," know that you're not alone. So Bakhtin talks about being on the threshold. We think about the father. He leaves the threshold twice, once for each of his sons. But the problem with the parable of the prodigal son is we focus on the one time the father leaves the threshold, the first time. And we kind of forget about the second time the father leaves the threshold. Now we get to the younger siblings. Brief story, my students, one of the things they love about my class is story time with Professor Mandy, because I have weird anecdotes. But I was about 8 years old. My youngest sister, Alyssa, is 7 years younger than me. She was 6 months old. And we had Sunday dinner. We went to the Baptist church in town. Yes, I grew up Baptist. And we would walk to my grandparents' house for Sunday dinner, where we would have, family debates and whatnot. So we're sitting around the family dinner table, and my mom has 3 kids present at lunch. And my mom looks at me and she says, "Mandy, where's Alyssa?" And I look back at her and I'm like, "I'm 8. I don't know." My parents had forgotten my youngest sister at church in the nursery. So youngest siblings, any youngest sibling ever be left somewhere? Your parents had the other kids in tow and somehow managed to forget, the youngest one. So the father leaves the threshold, and here's where the tables turn. We think of the younger children typically as being the prodigal, and the elder children as the rule followers. But both children fear being forgotten. Both children fear not having that place in their father's heart. Both children fear that the father won't leave the threshold for them. And I think this is where we see the brothers coming together. So interdivisiduality is how an encounter with another person changes and shapes us. The day the younger son left was the day the father's life changed forever, about as much as the day his birth changed his father's life forever. The day the elder son didn't come into the party and the father realized he was missing shows us who the father is. The father is the sort of person that will leave the threshold every time to go find the lost, the forgotten, and the one who fears they'll never be let in again. Our story is also shaped by other people's stories, and our stories are shaped by others. I don't know about any of you, but especially in today's increasingly circle the wagons sort of mentality, how many of you have had a conversation with someone with whom you disagree? How many of you stayed in relationship with that? You may or may not choose. You can selectively raise your hands. Many of us will choose to remain in relationship. And I would submit to you, it's not just because it's what God tells us to do, it's because it's what God shows us to do. It's because God continually invites us to leave the threshold. Because Jesus doesn't care if you voted for Donald Trump or Barack Obama. Jesus doesn't care. Because Jesus is of the business of leaving the threshold for you. So whatever your voting record, whatever the voting record of people that you love, this story transcends that. And your capacity to transcend that didn't come from nowhere. It came from leaving the threshold, a God who would leave the threshold to the extent that he would become human. Now we're going to move to one more theory, and then I'm going to give you all some time to talk among each other, and I'm going to come around and eavesdrop on your tables to see what you're talking about, to make sure you're following the assignment. No, I'm just kidding. Oh, that print's super small. I'm really sorry about that. Sorry if you can't read that. So Judith Butler grew up in a Jewish family, and for her, our existence is dependent upon encounters, again, at the threshold, with our parents, with our first friends. The first time we ask another person, who are you? What's your name? Will you be my friend? Many children carry with them experiences, memories of the first time someone didn't want to be their friend. Also, she talks about confession. She talks about how our lives and our confessions happen in media res, in the middle of everything, in the middle of the hot mess of your life. Who are you? Who is God in the middle of the hot mess of your life? Butler says, in giving an account of oneself, confession does not return a self to an equilibrium it has lost. It reconstitutes the soul on the basis of the act of confession itself. And when I read this, I thought, this Jewish woman is speaking Lutheran language. When we confess in church every Sunday morning, I have sinned in thought, word, and deed, what I have done, what I've left undone. We're asking God to reconstruct our hearts because they're so broken, we've forgotten how to leave the threshold. If you think about our confession, how often is sin represented when we won't go to the threshold, when we won't be there for one another, when we won't be Christ for one another, or can't be Christ for one another? God reconstitutes us. This Sunday, tomorrow, y'all are going to church tomorrow. I should see a bunch of heads going like this. We're all going to church tomorrow, yep. when you say the confession the next time, whether at home or at church or even in a silent moment with God, think about the business that God is about reconstructing you. This Bible, many people have read it again and again and again. Anybody read it multiple times? I grew up Baptist, so I read it multiple times, cover to cover, and had no idea what it meant, but I still did it because I knew I had to do that to make Jesus happy with me. And then I landed at seminary. God has a weird sense of humor. We read this story again and again and again. And at different seasons of life, it changes its personality. Reading Genesis 1 and 2, reading the story of Samson, reading the story of David at different seasons of life. You pick up on different things, different characters. And I think reading the parable of the prodigal son, reading at different seasons in life, we identify with different characters. It wasn't until I became a mother that I got even a glimpse of what the father went through. And my son is only 2.5. But I know that I would do anything for him. And I know the heartbreak when he falls. I know the heartbreak when he tries to get what he wants through inappropriate means, mostly whining these days. If any of y'all veteran parents have a solution to a 2.5-year-old whining, I am all ears. Just wait, thanks for that. Yeah, 3's worse, I've heard that too. But the point of confession is it reconstitutes us. And I think about my son, little Hugo. He has that timeout. And then I pick him up from the timeout, still crying. And what does he do? He wants comfort from me, the same person that put him in the timeout. I don't get it, but I'm so glad that is how God has constructed our relationship. That moment of confession where he can't say, "I'm sorry, Mama," very well, and he doesn't know what it means, but we still sometimes make it say it. But him wrapping his arms around my neck as an act of confession of who he is and who I am and who God is that gives us the power to forgive. So we're going to do a little bit of our own adventure. So I think being at the threshold and notions of confession work together, but I think I'll let you all choose what your activity will be. So I want you to imagine, if you will, we meet the people in the parable of the prodigals in the middle of their lives. What were their stories before they came to this point? Who was the prodigal son when he was 2? Who was the elder brother at the same age? And the father? What was the father like the day they were born? Or individuality. Who would the father be without the sons? Who would the brothers be without each other? And how are they dependent on or independent of one another? So go ahead and talk among yourselves for a few minutes about this, and then we'll move on. All right, I'm going to bring it back in. Special thanks to the table that let me eavesdrop on their conversation. It is interesting. At how many of your tables did you start sharing your own stories and your birth orders? That's great. I think as we get into these stories, what this story does is it touches on stuff, because the assignment was to talk about this story, but it's so deep. Hearing these stories can go so deep that it helps us teach our own story. And I think this is the gift of Scripture, and why there's this invitation to return to it again and again and again and again, because it helps us learn how to tell our story. It also gives us hope for the future, right? Which of the biblical examples was a really stand up good person? It's interesting reading a book full of sinners and realizing that God does God's best work at the threshold with sinners. All right. I think we are close here. Take a few, 3 minutes. We'll have to go fast and choose one of these ones. Tell your story in 3 to 5 sentences. What are the most important things to include? Why are they important to you? Or if you prefer, choose one of the characters from the story and retell it from their point of view. And this one will be a shorter time so that we can kind of keep rolling on schedule. Go ahead. All right, I did warn you it would be a little short. Feel free to continue these conversations during the break. The story we tell, how we tell our stories, actually shapes us. There have been recent studies that people that choose 3 things to be grateful for at the beginning and end of every day actually become happier, more gracious individuals. It's funny when you're looking for something, when you're looking for opportunities, how frequently they come. The stories we read shape us. This is one of the first ways we learn about faith. When we promise infants when they're born that we'll give them a Bible, it's us saying we're going to pass these stories down. We're going to take these stories to the threshold of the next generation. The stories we tell shape us, and how we tell the stories shapes us. And how we tell our story ultimately is our confession. How we talk about what God's done in our lives, or if we talk about what God has done in our lives. And if you don't talk about what God's done in your lives, I've encouraged you to start experimenting and start. Because once one person starts talking about what God has done in their lives, what happens in a faith community? It takes off like wildfire. Some of my colleagues here have done a lot of this work. And we continue to be shaped by God's story because God's story continues in each one of us. But what happens if we never open the Bible? Oh, yeah, I know what it says. We take away an opportunity to be at the threshold with God and God's narrative with us. Thank you. See you all this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Brobst-Renaud, for that, and what amazing conversations of crossing over thresholds. I came home yesterday afternoon, or last night, and I turned on the TV, and I don't know if you saw this, but there was North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and President Moon of South Korea, and what did they do? But they crossed over a border to start having conversation. So we need to take